Welcome along to today's webinar. I'm John James and I'm your host for today's event. Today's webinar is looking at co-innovation, a topic that's really close to my heart. And as you probably know, I always look for better ways of enabling change and finding ways to get increased adoption of innovations. When I talk about an innovation, usually defined as the process of transforming an idea or an invention into a product or a service that creates value. So when we're talking about co-innovation, that's the type of definition that we're looking at. I first heard today's presenter talk about the Primary Innovation Project a few years ago when I was attending an innovation forum in Melbourne. In fact, that Ruth Nettle was running, who has joined us today, which is lovely. Welcome along, Ruth. Now, I was excited from the very beginning as I could see the benefit of involving end users at the beginning of a research project instead of merely delivering the packaged innovation to the end users at the completion of the project. Often we're surprised when the end users then don't make much use of it. So within a short period of time, I actually contacted James Turner, the project leader, and kind of weaseled my way into his project by offering to provide webinars as a way to keep his geographically dispersed team connected. So I helped deliver bi-monthly webinars where different members of his project team give an update about their area of work. And I just love hearing those updates and seeing the progress being made. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great pleasure that I welcome James Turner as our presenter for today. He has almost 20 years research experience in the New Zealand forestry and agricultural sectors. He started out in forestry research looking at, I do believe, models of wood quality in standing trees. And then about 10 years ago, he went over to the US and did a PhD, then in economics, of course. And then he returned to New Zealand looking at research on land use and international wood product markets. And then he joined AgResearch to undertake research on innovation in the New Zealand primary sector. And as part of that work, James is now the project leader of a program called Primary Innovation. And the purpose of that 5-year program is to deliver and demonstrate co-innovation approach to practice change in the New Zealand primary industry sector. James, welcome along. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, the weather here in Toowoomba today, well, it's just gorgeous. So it started out cold, it was like 6 degrees, but now it might be about 20, 25, and it's a lovely blue sky. But do tell us, what's the weather like in Hamilton, New Zealand today?
Thank you very much, John. The weather here in Hamilton, we've been having thunderstorms rolling through to the extent that it managed to bend my television aerial, and so we had a couple of frustrated children in our household because they couldn't watch their favourite TV shows until we got up on the roof and rebend the aerial. So,
hey, look, welcome along. Where we can hear you clearly and we can see your presentation, so do tell us more about co-innovation.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for the opportunity to share some of the experiences that we've been developing from primary innovation, applying co-innovation in the New Zealand context across a number of sectors. And so when I go through my presentation, I'll talk about a number of examples from the Primary Innovation Project. And I do want to emphasise that co-innovation isn't restricted to just what we're doing in primary innovation. There are many other examples in New Zealand and Australia of these types of approaches. So in terms of the questions that I was keen to discuss with you and cover was first, what is this co-innovation? And I'm glad to hear that there's a number there of you who are just coming to be familiar with this term. So it'll be good to describe how we think of co-innovation. And then the obvious next question is, okay, if that's what co-innovation is, how do you actually do it? And there I'll talk about an example of how co-innovation was implemented in a particular project, the Apple Futures project, of which some of the people on this webinar were part of. And then another question that we often get is, because co-innovation involves more people and more time, is it really worth all of that effort? And I'll again talk about an example where we've estimated what the potential benefits, at least in economic terms, are of taking a co-innovation approach in one case study. So on that first question, what is co-innovation? Here I'd like to use the example of the Waimakariri irrigation scheme, which is an innovation project or case study in primary innovation involving M.S. Srinivasan, a hydrologist, a hydrological engineer from Niwa, working with the Waimakariri irrigation scheme, and especially a number of farmers in that scheme, to support them around improving the water use efficiency and the water supply reliability in that scheme. The role that MS is playing is working at the farm level around providing data that the farmers can make use of to improve their irrigation decisions, especially around when do they need to irrigate and how much to irrigate with. So he's providing information on forecasting water supply from the river and from weather forecasts, and matching that with data on water demand based on soil moisture monitoring. Providing that data in real time with the farmers, and in that practical process, helping to understand what information do the farmers need, in what form, and how does it help them make decisions, and then feeding that back into improving the information and how it's provided to those farmers. So when we talk about co-innovation to address that problem of improving water supply reliability and water use efficiency in the Waimakariri irrigation scheme, that part that MS is working on is one part of a larger puzzle, if you like. And co-innovation is about bringing those pieces of the puzzle together and making sure they fit. So you've got MS providing this real-time data to the farmers, but those farmers need to combine it with their own practices on farm around decisions to do with what crops they plant them, when they harvest them, what livestock they choose to finish, those sorts of things. And they might work with rural professionals to make those decisions in combination with information from MS. Another important piece of the puzzle is to make use of water and that information. Water storage is really important in the scheme. So there's a number of farmers who are developing water storage at the farm level, and there's also been exploration of the possibility of having water storage at the whole scheme level. Then another piece of the puzzle is the rules that the scheme uses to allocate water amongst the farmers in the scheme. So at the present, it's based on a turn at the tap, so that a farmer will come up to their turn, they'll get the allocation of water for that turn, and they don't know necessarily if they'll get another turn at the tap, and so they tend to use it because they may not get another opportunity. So the scheme's looking at new ways of allocating water, especially around the possibility of trading water allocations. But to do that, they also need to put in place information that captures how much water has been used, so water metering, if you like. Other parts that the scheme are working on is bringing in improved technologies for being more efficient about the application of water with irrigators. Then when you lift up from the farm level and above the scheme level, at the regional level, regional councils make the rules around the amount of water take, or amount of water that the scheme can take from the Waimakariri River. And that council is also working with communities in the region to set limits around the amount of nutrients that can be leached from different farming. And so those rules will influence farmers' decisions about when to apply water and how much to avoid leaching too many nutrients. And then the final piece of the puzzle is actually the pricing signals that processors provide to farmers about when they should finish stock or finish crops, and that again influences how they make use of their water. So this idea of co-innovation is one where you have multiple pieces of the puzzle, different people have those pieces of the puzzle, and how do you bring them together? So one way of looking at that is this idea of a sort of network of people who and organisations who are co-innovating. So you might have a farmer in the scheme who'd be working with a rural professional, a farm advisor, who's integrating knowledge and translating science knowledge around what crops and what livestock under what systems to use to make the best use of the water they have. The irrigation scheme, which sets the allocation rules. You have the regional council called ECAN, as I mentioned, who sets the rules around the water take. And Irrigation New Zealand is a lobby body that may negotiate with ECAN around the water take and other rules. Then another piece of the puzzle in that network is brought by the irrigator supply and the technologies that the farmers can use to improve water use efficiency. Then you have someone like MS Srinivasan from NIWA, which is the Crown Research Institute, developing those technologies around providing real-time data on supply and demand. And he may work with a university or with rural professionals to provide that data. And then finally, as I mentioned, you've got policies being provided by ECAN around the water take and nutrient management. Ministry for Primary Industries has a fund for funding water storage. And then, as I mentioned, processes around the pricing that they provide. Other parts of this network are key individuals, organisations that start to bring these pieces together. So in the case of the WOMAC, the Irrigation Scheme Chair, Gavin Reid, is what we might call a broker. He's working to bring these different people into the network and these different pieces of the puzzle, the allocation rules, the pricing, to help improve the water supply reliability in the scheme. So to summarise what co-innovation is, it's looking at change as being not just technical, so it's a combination of that information that MS provides in combination with social change, so around the farming practices of farmers in the scheme, market change, potentially around the pricing that processes provide, and also the way water is allocated in the scheme, and then policy changes at the scheme level, at the regional level, and at the national level. To bring these pieces together and make them fit into that puzzle, you need to develop these partnerships to co-develop, because each will need to be modified and changed so that they start to fit together. And that means, as I showed, forming those networks along the supply chain from farm to processor, involving central and local governments and potentially even consumers in some cases. So that was a whirlwind tour of what is co-innovation. It's a good time to stop at this stage and check in if there are any questions from you. And because I couldn't resist, I also put in some questions that I'd like to put back to you as well. We'll see how we go.
That's great. Thanks, James. So, folks, you can see the picture of the floating control panel there. So if you've forgotten, you just type your questions down here. So enter a question for staff, and then once you've typed them, they'll appear above it. So, James, you've just got a few. So, wow, one of the attendees is commenting how complex that system was and how neat your diagrams were, showing the different, I guess, actors or players in there. So the question was, well, how many different people or organisations were actually involved in that irrigation example that you gave?
Yeah, so in that one, this is off the top of my head, MS would know better, but you had MS at NIWA as a researcher, 2 key individuals from there. You had the irrigation chair, scheme chair, and the manager of the irrigation scheme involved. You had 5 farmers who are testing it, and then a wider group of farmers in the scheme who are learning from what those farmers directly involved in the project are learning. And then also they've at times brought in 1 or 2 individuals from the regional council as well, to also see what this might mean for the regional council policies. Yeah, so I think that got to about 10 or so, at least with more farmers. Yep.
Excellent, thank you. Now, the next question is about, can you just tell us a little bit more about that broker role, or unless you're going to cover that in the second half. And while you're thinking about that, just a reminder to the audience that James has posed us some questions as well. So as you can see on the screen, the first one is, well, you know, from your perspective, what is new, if anything, about co-innovation? And do you have any examples of tackling complex challenges with a linear approach, and how that went for you? But back to you, James. So yeah, can you tell us a bit more about that broker role, and like where are they from and the skills that they might have?
Yeah, that's a good point. I can touch on it at this stage, but and then come back to it when I talk about the next example of the how of co-innovation, because that example of Apple Futures had an individual and an organisation that played that brokerage role. And they are people or organisations who can see that bigger system, the bigger puzzle, and they are good at connecting with the people that may hold those different pieces of the puzzle, and if you like, being very collaborative about creating space to bring them in so that they can meet their overall need of, in the case of the WOMAC, improving water supply reliability, but also figuring out how can they meet the needs of those individual actors or organisations that are coming in. So how does MS as a scientist in NIWA also realised some of his needs around publishing papers and so on, while also helping the irrigation scheme with that technology around providing real-time data.
Okay, that's good. Now, a few more questions have come in, but I suspect you're going to cover them in the second half of your presentation. So how about we move to that now, please, James?
Okay then. Sure, and happy to come back to them if I don't cover them. So obviously it's very nice to build that picture of what co-innovation is, and already sort of getting a hint from some of the questions, that's all very nice, but how do you actually do it? How do you form these networks? So to answer that question, I'm going to use another example that we've looked at from the Primary Innovation Program, and I know Nicola Parker's on this call, and she's been involved intimately in this project, the Apple Futures project. She's from Plant and Food Research as a researcher, and they've been working closely with Pipfruit New Zealand, who's the industry body. So if we cast ourselves back to 2005, New Zealand apples are very much focused on export markets to over 65 countries, a very small domestic market, so reliant on those export markets to have profitable orchards. And in 2005, one of the challenges was that the UK, Europe is a large market, nearly 2/3 of our apple exports, was bringing in ultra-low residue requirements, so that there was few residues from pesticides sprayed and so on the apples. Now that's very nice, but at the same time we're also exporting to a lot of markets that have very strict requirements, phytosanitary requirements, or SPS requirements, that there's no pests on the apples. So the challenge for the industry was, how do we meet that low residue requirement from having few residues from pesticides while also having a pest-free apple? And that led over a 5-year period to a couple of programs to develop up a way of delivering those apples. So if we fast forward to the end of that program, where they got to in terms of this technology was a set of practices on orchard and along the apple supply chain to deliver low residue apples while meeting those phytosanitary requirements, and being able to demonstrate that they met those targets around allowable residues and also were pest-free. And now today, a few years ago, I was in Barkenen in the Netherlands, and you could see on the shelves in their supermarkets these New Zealand apples with 100% pure apples brand on them that says these are pest-free and low residue. In terms of the uptake from that program, the groundwork was laid back in the mid-90s with new practices around integrated fruit production. But over the 5-year period, by 2010, there was nearly 2/3 of the national planted area that was operating under that Apple Futures type of approach, producing those low residue pest-free apples. So incredible uptake in that small period. So how did they achieve that? Now, work that Nicola Park did was to go back to documents and interview people involved in the project to understand what was it that made that project a success. And not surprising, the first bit was the participation of multiple stakeholders. So they were very careful about, as everybody present needed to understand the problem of producing that low residue pest-free apple, understanding the causes of how you can do that, and being able to bring in those pieces of the puzzle, like in that irrigation scheme example, to develop workable solutions. So in the case of Apple Futures, you had Pipfruit New Zealand as an industry body, but also supply groups, the orchardists themselves, as well as the exporters and pack houses, who would be then sending off those apples, the supermarkets in the US and the EU and UK to understand their low residue requirements, the researchers from Plant and Food Research, and then government, both as a funder, but also as a regulator, and especially around their understandings of regulations around market access requirements for phytosanitary requirements, to make sure that what was being developed would meet those requirements. Now, it's all very nice to say you've got all these stakeholders. This is where I come back to that question about brokers. There were a key organisation and key individual in Apple Futures that brought together those elements of the solution and all of the stakeholders that had those elements. So a bit more of a definition of a broker. It can be an individual or an organisation, and they're very much focused on enabling stakeholders to actively participate in developing the parts of the solution and bringing those together. So they influence the context to innovate. They create, if you like, a space for those different stakeholders to bring in their knowledge and adapt their knowledge and their technologies and regulations on to fit with the other pieces that others are bringing. So in the case of Apple Futures, one of the brokers was a scientist at Plant and Food Research who their expertise was in that area of integrated fruit production, but they also brought in other areas of science, for example, technologies around washing apples at the processing stage to help remove any pesticide residues. The other broker was Pit Fruit New Zealand as that industry body. They provided strong leadership to bring in the different players. They accessed funding to resource the initiative by talking with the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, which is a government fund for market access projects. They coordinated a collective of exporters, so you've got a large number of exporters exporting to many different markets that have many different requirements. That creates quite a lot of effort to coordinate and meet their individual needs. And importantly, they created an expectation in the industry of developing these low residue apples as well. So it gave it real sort of push behind the initiative. So having brought those stakeholders together and brokered their connections, this creates the opportunity for solutions to emerge. And the important thing in Apple Futures was that that built on relationships and the trust in the relationships amongst those different stakeholders involved in developing Apple Futures. And that then created a platform where through ongoing interaction and regular interaction amongst those stakeholders, they could contribute their separate knowledge. So orchardists could bring in their knowledge of fruit production, apple production practices, and how they might be able to bring in the various practices around spraying and not spraying, and using spraying that's more driven by when it's needed rather than by the state. Then another important part of that learning was actually learning from lots of successes but also mistakes, and that's where the trust was important. So an example of that was during the program there was a large outbreak of woolly apple aphid, which could have potentially derailed the project perhaps. But because of those relationships built on trust, they were able to sort of go, okay, what's going on here? And they realized that a new chemical had been introduced and was being used in the orchards that was killing a natural predator of the woolly apple aphid. So they're able to learn from their mistakes. So ways of building in that interaction in the Apple Futures were having a collective body of exporters, so they could understand what their individual needs were, but also what their collective opportunities were from having that 100% pure apple brand. Orchardist discussion groups to learn from each other and how they're implementing the new integrated fruit production. And also other players like agri-chemical companies, consultants and exporters. And then finally the interaction between the science and the growers to share their different knowledge and lessons from the project. The fourth and final sort of key element to Apple Futures was that they funded ongoing testing and development of integrated fruit production out in orchards. And that's something we've found in New Zealand is an area that we're not particularly good at in other examples. So there's a lot of learning that goes on at that stage of putting a technology or practice out in the real world that leads to further refinement of the practice, and also making sure that that practice, say integrated fruit production, fits with the orchardist practices, but also fits with the market demands and with the exporters' requirements as well. So it's a part of, if you like, learning by using these technologies and practices and being able to respond to that learning. So in the case of Apple Futures, what they did was they were able to test this integrated fruit production across orchard blocks across the country, so they could adapt to the particular integrated fruit production to different regions and the apples they grow. It meant further refinement of the Apple Futures program, and it also meant that they were able to collect data in the real world in those orchards, and the orchardists were good about sharing that sampling data. So that was partly funded by the program in exchange for them being willing to share that data, and that becomes an important platform for demonstrating that the program is delivering those low residue pest-free apples. So that's the Apple Futures project, and those sort of 4 key elements, as you can imagine, multiple stakeholders being brought together by a broker that creates a space where they can learn together from each other, from their successes and mistakes, and especially learning in the real world by putting those technologies in the real world. Much like the WOMAC project is doing as well, with having that data from MS being shared in real time. But is it worth all that effort? So here I'll use another example from primary innovation, and this one is with Dairy NZ, and especially with Rob Brazendale and Sarah Dirks there, who have been working around developing a program to support improving the live weight, the target weight of dairy heifers that are coming from third-party graziers back onto the dairy platform, so that they're at a weight that means they'll be in calf and therefore can come back onto the dairy platform ready to sort of milk. And the question here that we put into that case study was, does taking a co-innovation approach lead to faster or greater adoption than business as usual? And in this case, we took, to be fair, an extreme case of business as usual, a technology transfer approach where we imagined that an idea was developed completely separate from the farmers and then it was given to them, whereas Dairy NZ has a much more closer engagement with farmers, obviously. So then the question is, given you've got this additional people and time, is that are you getting faster or greater adoption that offsets the additional people and time that you've needed to involve? So with that heifer rearing case, we did a cost-benefit analysis, traditional sort of economic model, and that's because the question was coming from investors in these types of programs, where they're interested in, are we getting value for money? Because the project's still ongoing and we haven't seen total uptake, we used the adopt model from CSIRO to make predictions of adoption rate and peak level with co-innovation, the approach that was taken, and what it might have looked like if they hadn't taken a co-innovation approach. What we picked up from the heifer rearing project was that the influence of co-innovation was to shift the project focus from one that was on efficiency gains for the dairy farmers to the livelihoods of contract graziers, those who use contract grazing as part of their wider farming business, which may include other livestock, sheep and beef. And also it meant that there was a shift to focus around the owner-grazier relationship. And what informed that from this approach was undertaking a large series of focus meetings with farmers and also having an advisory group that helped to understand better what the problem was that was influencing the target weights of heifers coming out of the platform. So using the adopt tool, we were able to predict the potential market size in terms of number of rising two-year-old heifers that were reared with that good practice that would be at a target weight. So the counterfactual, that tech transfer, was predicted to be much lower than with the co-innovation approach. And the flow-on effect with that was that when you looked at the cost savings to the industry from having to purchase fewer replacements because more heifers were coming on at the target weight, meant that there was a predicted annual net benefit of 12.2 million. And you can see in this graph here that while co-innovation has a higher cost at the start, associated with more people being involved in more time, it quickly, by about year 7, 8 and 9, overtook the predicted benefits from the tech transfer type approach. So in this case, we've got a sense that yes, there is value in spending that time up front to get the right understanding of the problem and develop workable solutions. So that's the end of the how of co-innovate, how to co-innovate, and also the is it worth it. So a good time now to just check in if there are more questions.
Lovely, thanks James, and we're doing really well for time, so we have good time available for answering some questions. So let me start running through some that our attendees have sent in, and I see the ones that you have posed to the audience on the screen, so they would be welcome to type those in as we cover the ones that have already been sent in. So James, first one is, how do you suggest we best create an environment to support co-innovation?
That's a really good question, very good question. That's part of what we're attempting to do in primary innovation as well, is to understand how you can create a wider innovation funding environment and organisations that support these innovation projects like Apple Futures, like the Waimakariri, like the Hefewering one. And some key parts are being able to build in flexibility early in programs, so that in the case of Hefewering, as Rob Brazendale described it, the funder for that project, Dairy NZ Incorporated, allowed a fuzzy front end. So they sort of said, okay, we're going to give you about a period of 6 months to explore the problem because we don't know exactly what it is. And then from that, we'll base on the ongoing funding around what the solution actually might be. So having that flexibility. Another part of that is building in evaluation to give confidence to funders that projects are progressing. Another important thing that we've found is the importance of resourcing those interactions and especially time up front to develop those networks. So the challenge we have in New Zealand is, especially for the formal research, a lot of projects, they need to have identified the solution right at the start, and that's usually done within the space of a 2-month call for proposals. Yeah, so hopefully that starts to answer that question.
Good, thanks James. So the next one is, when considering co-innovation, what drives the collaboration? So sometimes there are hidden agendas, egos and other barriers which hamper real understanding and progress within a co-innovation process. So in your mind, what drives that collaboration?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because some of the projects we've had in primary innovation have been really challenged by agendas that are hidden. So it's trying to upfront sort of understand what those agendas are, and we have people that we call reflexive monitors who are focused on facilitating the innovation process to help the different stakeholders understand what agendas they're bringing and explore how the individual agendas could be met while also achieving a collective agenda. Sometimes, to be honest, it doesn't work, and you perhaps have to sort of say, well, can we work with the stakeholder, which can make it challenging, especially if there's key individuals that you need. So that can take a lot of time, and the Hefewering project was one where that did take a lot of their time because there were many different agendas that needed to be addressed.
Okay,
so no easy answer there.
Quite a few more. No, that's right. Okay, so we're getting a few more questions coming in, so maybe shorter answers now, please, James.
Okay.
How much effort is required to educate the industry and community participants to think and engage with innovation?
God, my immediate reaction would be not a lot, to be honest. And quite a number of cases, people are already doing this. My own personal sense is that the challenge is more to do with how we organise innovation in New Zealand to support those people. At the moment it's hard to work in that way, though they want to work in that way.
Okay, fair enough. For Apple Futures, how does the co-innovation approach differ from good agricultural practices and programs like the NZ GAP, which is the good agricultural practices, which is a term I haven't come across. We talk about best management practices, so interesting to see good agricultural practices.
Yeah, that I, to be honest, can't answer. I'm not sure how the integrated fruit production matches with good agricultural practice. So that would be a question for Nicola.
Okay, very good. And actually, can you move forward to your next slide, because I believe you've got some resources and contacts for the attendees to see. Okay. And of course, folks, I'll send you a link so you can download today's presentation and also watch the recording again if you wish. So maybe the final question now for you, James, is what monitoring and evaluation measures are you using?
Lots. Yeah, so a central part is for each of the innovation projects we have a set of 9 principles that we're working to that touch on elements of enabling those 4 sort of key components of the Apple Futures program. So, for example, regularly checking in, have we got the stakeholders needed to understand the problem. And so one of the roles of the reflexive monitors is to regularly either evaluate or interview people to check how they're doing against those 9 principles. The other key thing is also developing measures that are indicators of progress towards the impact of the project, which helps the project participants keep an eye on where are they trying to get to. And also, that's part of a good sort of monitoring and evaluation practice to develop up those logics, those theories of change even.
Excellent. And would you care to estimate the investment that your project is making in monitoring and evaluation?
Oh, that's a good question. We've been working on the rule of thumb of about 10%. So each year it's about 150,000, I think. Yeah. I'd say money well spent.
Very good. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you, James. We'll hold it there because time is now escaping. So look, thank you so much for joining us today, James, and sharing that information about your beautiful co-innovation project. I'd particularly like to thank you for the time and effort you put into it, because I know it did take you quite a bit of time to condense all that information into our very short time available for the webinar. So on behalf of the audience, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you.
That's okay. And folks, just before you all dash away, I'll quickly mention that today's webinar has been brought to you by High Impact Training. So that's a new company I've recently established. So make sure that you pop over to the website, which I'll just send to you now, the link, highimpacttraining.com.au. Sign up to hear about further new webinars and workshops coming your way. Just click the lovely blue button there, and I'll be able to send you emails about future events. As easy as that. And don't forget that I'm always keen to hear your thoughts of the webinars that I run, and I'll send you a link to that in due course. And if you could just spend a couple of minutes, our monkeys will be waiting to read your responses, and I am your monkey. So folks, thanks for coming along today and interacting with us today. It's been great to have people from such a diverse geographic spread. So thanks for coming along. Thank you again, James, for sharing your information with us. And I wish you all the best until we meet again. So hooroo for now.